My late wife Eleanor left behind exactly one piece of jewelry that mattered: a heavy vintage silver medallion on a braided chain. When I found my bedroom drawer pried open and the velvet box empty, my daughter didn't even flinch. She just kept packing her designer swimsuits and told me the necklace was sold because it was gathering dust and she needed cash for a vacation. When I called the pawn shop to pay whatever it took to get it back, the owner stopped me cold. He said, "Sir, you will not believe what we found." When we opened the pendant, I never knew the pendant had a hinge. But what chilled my blood was what he said next. "Your son-in-law just called 5 minutes ago offering me $3,000 to burn whatever is inside." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The brass lock on my heavy oak dresser did not fail by accident. As a retired civil engineer, I have spent 40 years analyzing structural integrity, identifying the exact threshold where pressure overcomes resistance. Looking at the splintered mahogany and the twisted metal mechanism hanging uselessly from the drawer frame, the visual data provided a clear, indisputable conclusion. Someone had taken a flathead screwdriver, wedged it deep into the narrow gap, and applied violent, deliberate leverage. I did not need to search the room for clues. I did not need to wonder who had invaded my sanctuary. The empty depression in the dark velvet jewelry box screamed the answer. Eleanor's silver medallion was gone. It was the only tangible item of hers I kept in this house, the one physical anchor to a marriage that had defined my existence. I turned my back on the ruined drawer and walked heavily down the hallway, the hardwood floors echoing beneath my boots. I stepped into the living room, a space that was currently engulfed in a storm of expensive chaos. Sophia, my 32-year-old daughter, was aggressively shoving brightly colored designer swimsuits and silk cover-ups into a massive hard-shell suitcase. The room smelled overwhelmingly of her expensive floral perfume, masking the familiar scent of old paper and coffee that usually comforted me. She did not stop her frantic packing when my shadow fell across the carpet. She did not even look up. Her hands moved with a callous, dismissive energy, violently forcing zippers closed over overflowing fabric. "Where is your mother's necklace?" I asked. My voice was a flat, low hum, devoid of the theatrical shouting she might have expected. I have never been a man given to explosive rage. Rage is inefficient. It blinds you to the structural weaknesses of the situation. Sophia finally paused, resting one manicured hand on the handle of her luggage. She looked at me with a chilling, hollow indifference. There was no guilt in her eyes, no sudden realization of the profound violation she had committed. "The necklace was sold, Dad." She stated, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "It was just gathering dust in that locked drawer. Henry and I needed the cash for our trip to Cabo. We leave in 2 hours, and I am not going to argue with you about an old piece of silver." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the quiet air of my living room. She had not only violated my privacy and stolen my dead wife's legacy, but she had reduced Eleanor's memory to an obsolete asset to be liquidated for a luxury vacation. She grabbed a pair of sunglasses and tossed them into her personal bag, entirely ignoring the profound devastation radiating from my silence. "You broke into my locked drawer," I stated, maintaining my rigid composure. "You stole from me." Sophia rolled her eyes in an exaggerated gesture of profound annoyance. "Oh, stop being so dramatic," she sighed, pressing her body weight down onto the lid of the hard-shell suitcase to force it shut. "You have a pension. You own this house outright. You sit here all day hoarding things you do not even use. Henry has been incredibly stressed at work, and we deserve a break. Consider it an early inheritance advance." She pulled the zipper around the edge of the suitcase with a sharp, aggressive rip that sounded like tearing fabric. The metallic sound echoed in the quiet room, finalizing the transaction in her mind. She had justified her theft with a terrifying ease, entirely rewriting reality to cast herself as a victim, simply claiming what was rightfully hers. She did not see a grieving widower standing before her. She saw a bank account that had temporarily inconvenienced her. A loud, obnoxious car horn blared from the driveway. It was Henry sitting comfortably behind the wheel of a leased luxury sedan that I knew for a fact they could barely afford. The sound pierced the walls of the house, an arrogant summons, demanding that Sophia hurry up. Sophia grabbed the handle of her suitcase and hoisted it upright. She did not offer an apology. She did not offer a tearful explanation. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her expensive linen trousers, pulled out a crumpled yellow slip of paper, and tossed it carelessly onto the smooth surface of the kitchen island. It fluttered down, coming to rest next to the fruit bowl. "You can go buy it back if it means that much to you," she said over her shoulder as she walked briskly toward the front door. "We got $800 for it. Have a good week, Dad." The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind her, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. I stood alone in the absolute silence of my home. The air felt thick, heavy with the sudden crushing weight of parental failure. For years, I had made excuses for Sophia. I had rationalized her selfishness, attributing it to the stress of her modern life or the toxic influence of her husband. But the crumpled yellow paper sitting on my kitchen island erased all leniency. She had not simply made a mistake. She had calculated the value of my grief, weighed it against the price of a beach vacation, and chose the vacation. I walked slowly toward the kitchen island. I did not weep. I did not gaze out the window at the departing taillights of their car, mourning the daughter I had lost. Grief is a luxury reserved for those who are safe. Right now, my wife's legacy was sitting in a display case somewhere in the city, vulnerable to the whims of strangers. I picked up the yellow pawn slip. The cheap thermal paper felt gritty between my fingers. I smoothed out the creases, examining the faded black ink. It was a receipt from a place called Oliver's Gold and Silver Exchange, located on a gritty industrial avenue 3 towns over. It was exactly the kind of unlisted, desperate establishment someone would use to quickly liquidate stolen goods without drawing unwanted attention. The receipt detailed the transaction: one vintage silver medallion, braided chain, $800 cash payout, signed by Sophia Vance. The absolute clinical nature of the transaction fueled a cold, calculating determination inside my chest. I realized that if Henry was involved in this, it might constitute elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code of Grom 15.6.10.30. If he had falsified any documents to force the sale, it would be a clear violation of California Penal Code. Section 470 forgery, making the entire transaction void ab initio. I even considered invoking the prenuptial agreement infidelity clause, knowing how tightly Henry guarded his financial secrets. I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket, slid them onto the bridge of my nose, and read the phone number printed at the very top of the receipt. I reached for my cell phone and dialed the number. My hands were perfectly steady. The initial shock of the betrayal had entirely evaporated, replaced by a singular, focused objective. I was going to secure Eleanor's necklace before Melanie's plane even pushed back from the gate. I listened to the phone ring once, twice, 3 times, picturing the dusty interior of the pawn shop. I formulated my negotiation strategy. I would not bargain. I would not plead. I would simply offer double the payout amount in immediate cash. A rapid, undeniable transaction. A man with a gruff, tired voice answered on the 4th ring. "Oliver's Gold and Silver. We are closing in 20 minutes. "My name is William Vance," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "I am calling regarding a vintage silver medallion sold to you approximately 3 hours ago by a woman named Sophia. I have the claim ticket in my hand. I am prepared to offer you $1,500 in cash right now to secure that item. I will be at your establishment in 25 minutes. I anticipated a quick agreement, perhaps a greedy counteroffer. I did not anticipate the sudden heavy silence that stretched over the phone line. The background noise of the pawn shop seemed to vanish entirely. "Sir," the man named Oliver finally spoke, his voice stripped of its previous gruff indifference. It was now tight, cautious, and incredibly low. "Are you the original owner of this piece? Are you the husband?" "Yes," I replied, a sudden prickle of unease working its way up my spine. "It belonged to my late wife. I will pay whatever premium you require for its immediate return. I am leaving my house right now." Oliver let out a long, ragged exhale. "Sir, you need to listen to me very carefully. You will not believe what we found when we opened the medallion on this pendant." I stopped walking. My hand froze on the doorknob. "Open the medallion," I repeated, my engineering mind immediately rejecting the premise. "The pendant is a solid piece of cast silver. It is not a locket, it does not open." "Yes, it does," Oliver corrected me, his voice barely above a whisper. I was wiping down the tarnish on the back casing with a microfiber cloth, applying a little pressure to the rim. There is a microscopic recessed latch hidden perfectly in the engraved pattern. It gave way under my thumb. The whole back panel swung open on a concealed hinge. The floor beneath me felt suddenly unstable. 40 years as I had been married to Eleanor, I had watched her wear that heavy silver necklace every single day. During her final agonizing months of chemotherapy, she guarded it fiercely, never taking it off, even when the metal felt cold against her fragile skin. I had always assumed it was a sentimental attachment, a piece of vintage jewelry she simply cherished. I never knew it possessed a hidden compartment. "What is inside?" I demanded, my voice dropping to match his cautious tone. Oliver hesitated. The sound of his breathing amplified over the receiver. "It is a tiny, tightly folded slip of paper with a handwritten sequence of numbers and a very small brass safety deposit key." "But that is not why I am whispering, Mr. Reed." My blood turned to ice. The simple theft of an heirloom had instantly mutated into something vastly more complicated and dangerous. Eleanor had hidden a vault key. She had carried it against her chest until the day she died, explicitly keeping its existence a secret from me. "Why are you whispering, Oliver?" I asked, my grip on the phone tightening until my knuckles turned white. "Because someone else knows about this compartment," Oliver replied. The pawn shop owner's voice was laced with genuine anxiety. "A man just called this shop 5 minutes ago. He did not ask to buy the necklace back. He asked if I had opened it. When I played dumb, he offered me $3. Zeros in via instant wire transfer to take whatever was inside that pendant and immediately drop it into an incinerator. He said his name was Henry. He said, 'A courier is on the way to my shop right now to witness the destruction and hand me the cash.' The name hit me like a physical blow. Henry, my son-in-law. He had not merely tolerated Sophia stealing the necklace to fund a vacation. He had orchestrated the theft specifically to eliminate whatever Eleanor had hidden inside. He knew the secret of the medallion. He knew what that brass key opened, and he was absolutely desperate to ensure I never found it. He was willing to throw $3,000 at a pawnshop owner to burn the evidence, all while he and my daughter boarded a flight to Mexico. "Lock your doors," I commanded, my voice slicing through the air with absolute unyielding precision. "Do not answer the front entrance. Do not accept the wire transfer. I am leaving now. I will be at your back alley door in exactly 18 minutes. I did not wait for Oliver to respond. I terminated the call, shoved the yellow pawn slip into my breast pocket, and walked out the front door. The illusion of my peaceful retirement had just shattered, replaced by the terrifying realization that my late wife had spent her final days protecting me from a conspiracy I could not even see, and the thieves were my own family. I ended the call and walked out of my house. The front door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the silence of the empty rooms. My heavy work boots struck the concrete of the driveway with a steady rhythmic cadence. I did not run. Panic is the enemy of strategy, and I needed my mind to remain perfectly clear. I climbed into the driver's seat of my old pickup truck, twisted the ignition, and listened to the engine roar to life. The dashboard clock read 2:14 in the afternoon. Sophia and Henry were currently navigating airport security, confident they had liquidated a memory to fund a luxury vacation. They believed they had left a grieving, compliant old man in their wake. They were entirely wrong. I shifted the truck into gear and accelerated down the suburban street, leaving the manicured lawns and quiet sidewalks behind. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel with a force that made my knuckles turn white. Oliver, the pawnshop owner, had just handed me a puzzle piece that rearranged the entire landscape of my existence. The heavy silver pendant did not just hold sentimental value, it held a brass safety deposit key. And Henry knew about it. He knew exactly what it was, and he was desperate enough to wire $3,000 to a total stranger just to see it incinerated. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, merging onto the highway that cut toward the industrial edge of the city. The smooth asphalt rushed beneath my tires as the speed limit climbed. My mind began to rapidly dissect the timeline of the last 2 years. I needed to understand how I had been so utterly blind. The image of the silver medallion flashed behind my eyes, bringing with it a flood of memories that now carried a completely different, horrifying context. Eleanor had been diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer 18 months before she passed away. It was a brutal, unforgiving sentence. During those final agonizing months of chemotherapy, her body had wasted away, but her spirit had turned to absolute iron, and she wore that heavy vintage silver necklace every single day. I remembered the harsh fluorescent lights of the oncology ward, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitors, and the smell of sterile alcohol wipes. Through it all, the silver chain remained secured around her neck. I vividly recalled a specific Tuesday afternoon in the radiology department. The technician, a young woman with a gentle voice, had asked Eleanor to remove all metal objects before entering the magnetic resonance imaging machine. Eleanor had flatly refused. She sat in the wheelchair, her hands trembling from the medication, and clutched the silver pendant so tightly her fingernails cut into her own palms. I had stepped in trying to gently coax her, telling her it would only take 40 minutes, telling her the necklace would be safe with me. Eleanor had looked up at me with eyes so fierce and desperate that I immediately backed away. She fought the nurses. She signed legal waivers. She ultimately forced the hospital to find an alternative scanning method, all to keep that piece of silver anchored to her chest. At the time, I believed it was the irrational attachment of a dying woman clinging to a familiar object. I thought the medallion brought her comfort, a reminder of the life we had built together before the sickness invaded our home. I had stood by her hospital bed, night after night, watching her sleep, watching her thin fingers trace the engraved patterns on the metal casing, even while she was completely unconscious. I thought she was holding on to a memory. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my foot pressing harder against the floorboard. The truck surged forward, weaving past a slow-moving transport van. The truth was far more devastating than sentimentality. She was not holding on to a memory. She was guarding a vault key. She was protecting a secret. Eleanor was a forensic auditor before she retired. She had spent her entire professional career dissecting financial anomalies, tracking hidden assets, and uncovering corporate fraud. Her mind was a steel trap of numbers and ledgers. If she had hidden a safety deposit key inside a microscopic compartment of a vintage necklace, it was because she had found something fundamentally wrong within our own family. She had discovered a betrayal so profound that she could not simply tell me about it. She knew I would demand proof. She knew I would try to find a logical explanation for our daughter and son-in-law. She knew my blind spot was my own flesh and blood, so she gathered the evidence. She secured the proof. She locked it away in a vault and carried the only key around her neck until her dying breath. She was protecting me from them. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air in the truck cabin suddenly felt thin. I rolled down the window, letting the harsh, rushing wind snap against my face. The pieces were locking together with terrifying precision. Henry was not an impulsive man. He was an arrogant, calculating opportunist who believed he was always the smartest person in the room. Offering $3,000 to destroy a pawn necklace meant he was covering his tracks. It meant whatever Eleanor had locked in that bank vault possessed the power to completely destroy him. I navigated the highway exit ramp, the tires protesting, as I took the sharp curve at high speed. The landscape shifted from commercial retail to the decaying brick facades of the industrial district. Oliver's Gold and Silver Exchange was located 3 miles deep into this grid of forgotten warehouses and narrow alleys. I checked the dashboard clock again. 2:29. Oliver had said a courier was on the way. Henry was likely paying a premium for speed hiring someone local who could reach the shop, verify the destruction of the key, and collect the cash before I could intervene. It was a race against a man I had welcomed into my home, a man I had shared countless holiday dinners with, a man who was actively orchestrating my ruin from an airport departure lounge. I refused to lose this race. I pressed the accelerator to the floor. The engine howled in response. The streets here were cracked and uneven, littered with debris and abandoned vehicles. I swerved around a stalled delivery truck, ignoring the angry honk of a driver coming from the opposite direction. My focus was absolute. I was no longer a grieving widower trying to retrieve a lost keepsake. I was an engineer dismantling a hostile structure. Henry had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed the pawn shop owner would be blinded by the immediate offer of $3,000. He assumed a man working in a gritty exchange shop would ask no questions and happily burn a piece of metal for easy money. But Henry did not understand people. He only understood transactions. Oliver had recognized the desperation in Henry's voice, and Oliver had chosen to call the original owner instead. I turned onto the avenue where the shop was located. The buildings here were covered in faded paint and security grates. I scanned the street ahead looking for the address. I needed to reach that brass key. I needed to open the vault Eleanor had prepared for me. I needed to see exactly what kind of theft warranted this level of desperate cover-up. My daughter had packed her bags and left me with a casual wave, treating the sale of her mother's necklace as a minor inconvenience. She had undoubtedly justified it in her mind, convincing herself that she was entitled to whatever value she could extract from my home. But Sophia was merely the instrument. Henry was the architect. He had directed her to steal that specific necklace. He had waited until she pawned it, probably tracking her movements, and then immediately called the shop to arrange its destruction. He wanted the evidence incinerated while his hands were completely clean. The avenue narrowed as I approached the final block. I saw the faded neon sign for Oliver's Gold and Silver Exchange hanging above a reinforced glass storefront. The front entrance faced the main street, exposed and vulnerable. If Henry's courier was a professional, he would approach from the front, demanding immediate entry. Oliver had promised to lock the doors, but a locked glass door is only a temporary barrier against a motivated individual carrying thousands of dollars in cash. I did not slow down as I passed the front of the shop. I kept my foot on the gas, drove straight past the main entrance, and sharply turned the steering wheel, throwing the heavy pickup truck into the narrow, shadowed alleyway that ran directly behind the row of businesses. The tires kicked up loose gravel and broken glass as I navigated the tight space. I needed an element of surprise. I needed to secure the perimeter before the courier could establish dominance over the situation. I slammed the brakes. The truck skidded to a harsh stop directly. Behind the heavy steel service door of the pawn shop, I threw the vehicle into park, killed the engine, and stepped out into the damp shadowed air of the alley. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic. I walked toward the steel door, my boots silent on the concrete. I raised my fist and knocked twice, hard and deliberate. I was ready to face whatever consequence Eleanor had left behind. I was ready to dismantle them entirely. The heavy steel of the service door felt cold against my knuckles. I hit it 3 times, a sharp and rhythmic sequence that echoed down the damp brick walls of the narrow alley. I stood perfectly still, listening closely. Over the low background hum of the city traffic, a new sound cut through the heavy afternoon air. It was a violent rhythmic thewing coming from the main street. Someone was pounding on the reinforced front glass of Oliver's Gold and Silver Exchange. The sound was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, entitled hammering of a man who expected immediate compliance. Henry had not hired a simple delivery driver. He had sent an enforcer, someone paid a premium, to ensure the vault key never saw the light of day. A heavy deadbolt slid back on the other side of the steel door. The hinges winded loudly as the metal cracked open just enough to reveal the shadowed interior. A pair of anxious eyes peered through the narrow gap. "Are you William?" a growly voice demanded over the escalating noise from the front. I pushed the door open, forcing the man to step back. "I am William Vance," I replied, stepping into the cramped back room of the pawn shop. "Lock it." The owner, Oliver, did not hesitate. He threw his body weight against the door, sliding 3 separate deadbolts firmly into place. He was a man who clearly understood the language of desperation, his hands shaking slightly as he secured the final lock. The back room smelled strongly of old dust, metallic polish, and cold sweat. Oliver wiped his palms on his stained apron, his eyes darting continuously toward the narrow hallway that led to the main showroom. The pounding on the front window grew significantly louder, rattling the glass display cases lining the walls. "He is going to break the glass," Oliver whispered, backing away from the hallway entrance. I walked past Oliver, my boots stepping heavily on the faded linoleum floor. I moved into the shadows of the main showroom, purposefully keeping my body out of the direct line of sight from the street. The front of the shop was protected by a thick sheet of plexiglass and a heavy metal security grate that had been pulled halfway down. Through the glass, I saw the courier. He was a large man wearing a dark jacket, aggressively slapping the palm of his hand against the window pane. He held a thick manila envelope in his other hand, undoubtedly containing the $3,000 Henry had promised. Henry was arrogant enough to believe that raw intimidation and a stack of $100 bills could easily erase the consequences of his actions. I stood quietly in the shadows, observing the structural dynamics of the situation. The courier was a blunt instrument sent to execute a very simple transaction. He did not know what he was buying. He only knew he was being paid handsomely to retrieve a silver pendant. Eleanor had always told me that criminals inevitably leave a trail because they panic when their foundation is threatened. During her decades as a ruthless forensic auditor, she caught embezzlers and corporate thieves not by confronting them directly, but by watching how they moved when they realized the numbers no longer balanced. Henry was panicking. His foundation was cracking rapidly, and he was throwing money at the problem to blind everyone around him. I turned my attention back to Oliver, who was standing nervously near the register. "Where is the necklace?" I asked my voice, projecting absolute calm over the disturbing noise of the courier outside. Oliver reached under the counter, retrieving a small velvet tray. He placed it carefully on the scratched glass of the display case. Sitting directly in the center of the tray was my late wife's silver medallion. I stepped out of the shadows and approached the counter. The silver was cold and slightly tarnished, carrying the heavy weight of Eleanor's final days. I picked it up, my thumb running over the familiar engraved patterns. It felt exactly as it had when she wore it, a solid and unyielding piece of metal. But now, guided by Oliver's earlier phone revelation, I pressed my thumb against the microscopic seam along the bottom edge. A tiny, almost imperceptible click vibrated against my skin. The back panel of the medallion swung open on a brilliant, completely concealed hinge. My breath caught in my throat. Nestled safely inside the hollow cavity was a tightly folded square of thin paper and a miniature brass key. It was a safety deposit key, a standard-issue vault access tool identical to the ones used at my personal bank. I stared at the brass key resting in the palm of my hand as the true weight of Eleanor's silence pressed down on me. She had known her body was failing. She had known the cancer was spreading through her bones, stripping away her physical strength day by day. But her mind had remained an impenetrable fortress. While I was entirely focused on her medical charts and hospital bills, she had been silently orchestrating a defensive perimeter against our own daughter and son-in-law. She had secured the undeniable evidence of their betrayal inside a bank vault and hidden the only map within a piece of jewelry she knew I would never discard. She had trusted my eventual grief to preserve her secret until the day I finally needed it, and that day was today. The courier outside let out a muffled shout, his patience completely evaporating. He kicked the bottom of the front door, the heavy boot vibrating the metal frame violently. "Hey, I know you were in there," the man yelled through the thick glass. "Open the door. I have the cash right here. We can make this quick and easy." Oliver flinched visibly, reaching instinctively for a heavy flashlight hidden under the counter. "Should I call the police?" Oliver asked, his voice cracking with fear. "No," I replied carefully, extracting the folded paper and the brass key from the silver medallion. "Involving the local authorities right now introduces uncontrolled variables. Henry simply wants to buy your silence. Let him believe he has failed because his hired help was just too slow." I pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from my interior breast pocket. I had purposefully emptied my emergency safe before leaving my house, knowing that securing Eleanor's secret would require immediate, undeniable liquidity. I counted out exactly $1,600 and placed the money flat on the glass counter. "This fully covers the original payout and your premium for your honesty," I stated. Oliver looked down at the money, then glanced back at the angry man pounding on the door outside. "Take the money, Oliver. Your transaction with my family is officially concluded." Oliver swallowed hard, his hands trembling, as he scooped the cash into his apron pocket. "What do I tell the guy outside?" Oliver asked, stepping away from the counter. You tell him the absolute truth, I said, slipping the brass key and the folded note securely into my jacket pocket. You tell him that the original owner arrived first. You tell him the medallion is gone. I turned away from the counter and walked purposefully back toward the shadowed hallway. The courier struck the glass again, the sound echoing loudly through the dusty shop. I did not look back. Every second I spent in this building was a second Henry had to formulate a backup plan. I needed to reach the bank before the end of the business day. I needed to open that vault and retrieve whatever weapon Eleanor had forged for me to use. I moved swiftly through the cluttered back room, unlatching the heavy deadbolts on the steel alley door. The cool and damp air of the industrial district rushed in, smelling of motor oil and wet brick. I stepped out into the alley and pulled the metal door shut behind me, listening to the heavy click of the lock engaging securely. I walked toward my pickup truck, my boots crushing the loose gravel. The pounding from the front of the shop continued a pathetic and failing rhythm of a collapsing conspiracy. Henry had tried desperately to burn his mistakes, but he had acted far too late. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, slamming the door shut, the silence of the cabin instantly wrapped around me. I pulled the folded piece of paper from my pocket. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady during the entire confrontation, now betrayed a slight, undeniable tremor. I unfolded the fragile paper. It was Eleanor's handwriting, sharp and incredibly precise, entirely untouched by the severe tremor of her illness. It contained a single line of text. It was a routing number and account code, and the exact address of the main branch of our bank downtown. At the very bottom, she had written a brief chilling instruction. Do not trust Sophia. Check the equity. The words burned directly into my retinas. Check the equity. As a retired civil engineer, my entire life was built on ensuring that foundations were sound, that load-bearing walls could actually withstand the applied pressure. Eleanor was telling me that my foundation had been severely compromised. She was telling me that my daughter and Henry had not just stolen the simple necklace. They had deeply infiltrated the very structure of our financial security. The betrayal was no longer just an act of petty theft to fund a luxury vacation. It was a calculated, sustained attack on my home and my livelihood. I started the truck engine. The mechanical roar filled the narrow alley, easily drowning out the distant shouts of the frustrated courier. I shifted the vehicle into gear and accelerated aggressively, leaving the pawn shop behind in the rearview mirror. My primary objective had shifted entirely. I was no longer playing defense. I was moving to completely secure the high ground. Henry thought he was dealing with a tired, compliant old man. He thought I would sit in my empty house and mourn a lost trinket while he spent my money on a beach. He was about to discover exactly what happens when you attempt to dismantle the life of a man who knows precisely how to build things back up, stronger and infinitely more dangerous. I pressed the accelerator, firmly merging back onto the highway, heading straight for the bank. The real reckoning was about to begin. I pulled the tiny folded square of paper from the silver cavity. It was incredibly small. Eleanor must have used a pair of tweezers to wedge it so deeply into the hidden compartment. I flattened it against the glass counter. Next to it, I placed the small brass key. The key was a standard design. I had seen dozens of them throughout my life. It was a safety deposit box key. The brass was completely untarnished. It had been cut recently. I stared at the deep grooves filed into the metal edge. As an engineer, I understood that every cut on that key corresponded to a specific mechanical pin inside a heavy steel vault door. That key was designed to bypass a physical barrier. Eleanor had forged a weapon for me. I turned my attention to the square of paper. The creases were sharp. I smoothed them out with the pad of my thumb. The white paper was marked with black ink. I instantly recognized the handwriting. It was the elegant slanted cursive that had graced 40 years of birthday cards and grocery lists. But this was no casual note. It was a sequence of 9 numbers. I read the sequence twice. It was a bank routing number. I knew this specific sequence of digits by heart. It belonged to the main downtown branch of the financial institution where we had kept our joint accounts for 3 decades. Eleanor was not leaving me a sentimental farewell message. She was giving me a set of precise geographic coordinates. A harsh grating sound suddenly shattered the quiet interior of the pawn shop. The noise came from the front door. The courier was no longer using his fist to strike the thick, reinforced glass. The dull thudding had been replaced by the sharp scraping of hardened steel against brass. I looked up from the glass counter. Through the dim light of the showroom, I could see the silhouette of the man pressing his body against the front entrance. He had a metal tool wedged deep inside the lock cylinder. He was aggressively forcing a tension wrench into the mechanism. He was attempting to pick the deadbolt. Henry had not sent a mere delivery driver. He had hired someone with the skills and the willingness to commit a daylight burglary. Henry was absolutely terrified of what I held in my hand. Oliver let out a sharp gasp. He stumbled backward, and his shoulder collided with the display shelf. A velvet tray holding silver rings fell to the floor. The rings scattered across the linoleum with a chaotic clatter. "He is breaking in," Oliver whispered. His eyes were wide with genuine panic. He looked at the heavy flashlight resting on the counter and then looked back at the front door. "He is going to get through that lock." "Do not panic," I told him. My voice was a steady and flat drone. "Panic destroys your ability to control the environment. Where is the release mechanism for your exterior security?" "Great." Oliver pointed a shaking finger toward a heavy steel chain bolted to the wall near the front register. "It is a manual release," he said. "You have to pull the retaining pin and drop the chain." I did not waste a single second. I swept the brass key and the folded note off the glass counter and shoved them deep into the front pocket of my trousers. I left the silver medallion resting on the velvet tray. The silver was completely useless now. The true value had already been extracted. I walked quickly across the showroom floor. My heavy work boots did not falter. I kept my body low, staying out of the direct line of sight from the street. The scraping noise at the front door grew louder. The courier was applying brutal force to the lock pins. I could hear the internal mechanism clicking as he worked the tension wrench. He was seconds away from breaching the entrance. I reached the steel chain bolted to the wall. I grabbed the heavy retaining pin and pulled it hard to the left. The pin slid out of its housing with a loud metallic scrape. I released my grip on the thick iron chain. Gravity did the rest. The massive steel security grate positioned above the exterior windows and door plummeted downward. It hit the concrete sidewalk outside with an earth-shattering crash. The sound was deafening. The impact shook the front wall of the building and vibrated through the floorboards. I saw the courier leap backward just as the rusted steel bars slammed into the pavement directly in front of his boots. A thick cloud of street dust bloomed against the glass. The storefront was instantly sealed behind a wall of impenetrable iron. The courier shouted something angry and muffled from the other side of the grate. He kicked the steel bars violently, but the heavy metal did not even bend. The physical threat was entirely neutralized. The pawn shop was secure. I turned back to Oliver. The owner was leaning against the back wall, clutching his chest and breathing heavily. "You can keep the silver pendant," I told him. "The money I placed on your counter is yours. You earned it by choosing to make that phone call. Do not raise that security grate for at least 30 minutes. By then, the man outside will have realized he failed his employer and he will leave." Oliver simply nodded. He did not speak. He stared at the stack of $100 bills resting on his glass display case. I turned away from him and walked back down the narrow hallway toward the rear exit. The air in the back room felt different now. The heavy weight of grief that had paralyzed me just an hour ago was completely gone. I felt nothing but a cold and brilliant clarity. I pushed the heavy deadbolts on the back door aside. I opened the steel door and stepped out into the damp alleyway. The afternoon sun cast long, dark shadows across the cracked pavement. I closed the door behind me and listened to the locks engage. I stood alone in the quiet alley and pressed my hand against my trousers. I could feel the hard shape of the brass key through the fabric. My daughter Sophia had stolen a piece of jewelry to fund a vacation. She had acted out of simple entitlement, but Henry had recognized the necklace. He knew exactly what it meant. He had immediately wired thousands of dollars to an unknown shop owner to destroy the key before I could ever find it. This meant Henry was intimately aware of the bank vault. It meant he knew exactly what Eleanor had discovered. My late wife had spent her final days engaged in a silent war against my own son-in-law. She had fought a battle I never even saw. She had gathered the evidence and secured it behind a steel door. I walked toward my pickup truck. My boots crunched over the loose gravel. I did not feel like an old retired man anymore. I felt like an engineer who had just been handed the blueprints to a collapsing bridge. I unlocked the truck and climbed into the driver's seat. I inserted my key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I pulled the gear shift and pressed the accelerator. The truck surged forward out of the alley and merged back onto the main road. I drove directly toward the financial district. I was not going home. I was not calling my daughter to beg for an explanation. I was going to the bank. I was going to hand this brass key to the vault manager, and I was going to retrieve the ledger my wife had left behind. Henry believed he could simply erase the past by burning a piece of silver. He was about to learn that you cannot burn a foundation once the concrete has already been poured. The memory of my wife was no longer a source of pain. It was a meticulously designed weapon, and I was finally ready to use it. The drive to the downtown financial district took exactly 22 minutes. I parked my truck in a loading zone right outside the main branch of the bank, completely ignoring the parking enforcement vehicle half a block away. A parking citation was an irrelevant detail. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the cavernous air-conditioned lobby. The bank was busy with afternoon customers, standing patiently behind velvet ropes, waiting for available tellers. I did not take a numbered ticket. I did not join the line. My trajectory was a straight, uncompromising line across the marble floor, cutting directly past the queue and heading straight for the frosted glass partitions of the executive management desks. A young security guard stepped forward, raising his hand to intercept me. I did not break my stride. I looked directly into his eyes and kept moving with the heavy, measured momentum of a man who belonged exactly where he was going. The guard hesitated, his hand dropping just enough for me to bypass him without a single word. I approached the polished mahogany desk of the senior vault manager. He was a man in his late 50s dressed in a sharp gray suit, currently typing an email. He looked up, his expression instantly shifting into a practiced mask of polite customer service annoyance. "Sir," the manager said, gesturing toward the lobby, "the teller line begins near the entrance. If you need assistance with an account, one of our representatives will call your number shortly." I reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out the small brass key and the folded slip of white paper. I placed them flat on the center of his immaculate desk. The metal hit the wood with a dull, heavy click. "My name is William Vance," I stated, my voice low and commanding. "I am not here to make a deposit, and I am not here to wait in a line. I am here to access a secure lockbox registered to my late wife, Eleanor Vance." The manager glanced at the brass key, then at the routing numbers written in Eleanor's precise cursive. His polite annoyance vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp, professional focus. He picked up the folded paper, adjusted his glasses, and typed a rapid sequence of numbers into his computer terminal. I watched his eyes scan the screen. I saw his posture stiffen. He stopped typing and looked back at me, his demeanor entirely transformed into absolute compliance. "Mr. Reed," the manager said, his voice dropping to a discreet murmur, "please accept my deepest condolences for your loss. We have been waiting for you to come in." His words triggered a cold realization. Eleanor had not just rented a box. She had anticipated this exact sequence of events. She had engineered a mechanism that would only engage when she was no longer here to protect herself. "Explain the parameters of this account," I commanded. The manager turned his monitor slightly, though shielding the screen from my direct view. "Your wife established this secure deposit box 18 months ago," he explained, his tone clinical and precise. "However, she implemented a highly irregular access mandate. This box is not governed by standard joint account protocols. During her lifetime, you were completely restricted from opening it. The account carried a strict post-mortem trigger. I listened to the structural design of her final secret 18 months ago. That was exactly when her diagnosis shifted from treatable to terminal. That was when she realized her time was running out and that she needed to build an impenetrable wall between her findings and our family." The manager continued reading from his screen. "The mandate specifies that upon the presentation of her certified death certificate, sole and exclusive access transfers immediately to you. Furthermore, Mrs. Reed explicitly blocked any secondary access. She filed legal injunctions stating that no power of attorney, no executive of estate, and no next of kin, other than William Vance, is permitted past the vault door. She specifically flagged the names of your daughter Sophia and a Mr. Henry Vance. If either of them attempted to access this branch, our security protocol requires us to immediately contact law enforcement. The breath caught in my throat. Eleanor had known. She had seen the rot inside Henry long before he ever picked up a phone to bribe a pawn shop owner. She knew Henry would eventually attempt a financial takeover, and she had effectively built a legal landmine waiting for him to step on it. She starved him of oxygen, denying him the very evidence he desperately sought to destroy. "I have my identification," I said, pulling my driver license and my military veteran card from my wallet. "I also have the original copies of her death certificate in my vehicle. If your system requires physical verification." The manager shook his head, standing up from his heavy leather chair. "That will not be necessary for entry today, Mr. Reed. Your wife instructed our legal department to verify the public records on our end to ensure zero delays when you finally arrived. We verified her passing 3 weeks ago. The vault is yours. Please follow me." I followed the manager away from the desk and toward the back of the bank. We walked down a quiet, carpeted corridor, leaving the ambient noise of the public lobby far behind. We arrived at a massive circular steel door. It was a beautiful, terrifying piece of engineering, built to withstand incredible force and profound disaster. The manager engaged a biometric scanner, entered a passcode, and rotated the heavy locking wheel. The steel door unsealed with a deep, echoing thud, swinging open to reveal the sterile, brightly lit interior of the secure vault. The air inside was cold and completely motionless. The walls were lined with of identical rectangular steel doors. The manager walked down the third aisle, his eyes tracking the engraved numbers. He stopped in front of a box near the bottom corner. He inserted his master key into the left cylinder and turned it. The mechanism clicked loudly. He stepped aside and gestured toward the lock. "Your key goes into the right cylinder, Mr. Reed. Once the box is removed, you may use the private viewing room at the end of the hall. Take as much time as you require. I will wait outside the main door." I stepped forward. The brass key felt warm in my hand. I slid it into the narrow slot and turned it clockwise. The heavy metal drawer released. I pulled the long rectangular steel container from the wall. It was surprisingly heavy. I carried it out of the vault and walked into the small windowless viewing room the manager had indicated. The room contained nothing but a polished wooden table, a single chair, and a bright overhead light. I closed the door behind me, sealing myself in complete isolation. I placed the steel box in the center of the table. I sat down in the chair. The silence in the room was absolute. There were no distractions, no daughter packing a suitcase, no arrogant son-in-law honking a car horn. There was only me and the legacy my wife had died to protect. I placed my hands flat on the cold metal lid of the box. Eleanor had spent her final months locked in a silent, agonizing war, using her brilliant mind to track a betrayal that was happening right under my roof. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the cold air into my lungs. I lifted the steel lid and looked inside. The lid of the steel box felt heavy in my hands as I lifted it back. The hinges operated in absolute silence. I looked down into the dark rectangular cavity, expecting perhaps a final letter, a revised will, or some hidden family heirloom. Instead, I found a single object resting on the bare metal. It was a thick, black leather-bound ledger. The cover was worn at the edges, showing signs of heavy recent use. I recognized it immediately. It was the same brand of accounting book my wife had used for her entire professional life. Before her retirement, Eleanor had not been a simple bookkeeper. She was a senior forensic auditor for a major corporate firm. Her entire career had been defined by an uncanny ability to track missing capital through labyrinths of dummy corporations and hidden offshore accounts. She was a woman who could look at a wall of numbers and instantly spot the single anomalous digit. She hunted discrepancies for a living. She possessed a mind that was naturally suspicious and relentlessly analytical. I stared at the black ledger, realizing with a sudden, profound clarity that her professional instincts had not faded when she received her terminal diagnosis. The cancer had destroyed her body, but it had never touched her mind. I reached into the box and lifted the ledger. It was heavy, dense with information. I set it flat on the polished wooden table under the harsh glare of the overhead light. I opened the cover. The pages were filled with her immaculate slanted handwriting. There were columns of dates, transaction numbers, and routing codes. As I turned the first few pages, I realized this was not a record of our household expenses. This was a dedicated surgical audit of my personal retirement accounts and our joint savings. The dates entered in the margins aligned perfectly with the timeline of her illness. While I was sitting in waiting rooms drinking stale coffee and worrying about her white blood cell counts, she had been sitting in the chemotherapy chair with her laptop reviewing our financial statements. She had been working. I traced my finger down a column of numbers on the third page. My breath caught in my throat. She had highlighted a series of wire transfers that began roughly 8 months ago. The transfers were relatively small at first, just a few thousand moving from my primary savings into a secondary checking account I rarely monitored. I turned another page. The amounts grew significantly larger. $10,000, $15,000. The dates corresponded to the weeks when Eleanor was at her weakest, when I was entirely consumed with administering her medications and managing her care. Someone had seized upon my distraction to quietly drain the reservoirs of my life's work. I did not need to guess who was responsible. Eleanor had already drawn the map. Beside each fraudulent transfer, she had written a corresponding destination account. They were accounts tied directly to Henry and Sophia. The meticulous nature of the ledger was devastating. Eleanor had cross-referenced routing numbers, pulling data that proved Henry was intercepting my physical mail to hide the bank statements. He had manipulated the online portal passwords. He had systematically isolated my finances while I was blinded by the impending loss of my wife, and Sophia, my own daughter, had facilitated the entire operation. Eleanor had noted dates when Sophia had explicitly offered to handle the household bills to give me a break from the stress. I had thanked her for her kindness. I had kissed her forehead and told her she was a good daughter. Every single time she took those bills, she was paving the way for her husband to siphon our wealth. I sat back in the chair. The silence in the viewing room felt suffocating. The cold reality of the situation washed over me. Eleanor had uncovered a massive sustained fraud occurring right under my roof. She possessed the concrete evidence required to send our son-in-law to a federal penitentiary. Yet, she had chosen not to confront them. She had not called the police. She had not even told me. As I stared at the pages of the ledger, the reason for her silence became painfully obvious. It was the deepest cut of all. She had kept this secret because she knew exactly who I was. For 32 years, I had maintained a massive blind spot when it came to Sophia. I was the father who forgave every transgression, who paid off every credit card debt, who always believed my daughter was merely misguided rather than malicious. If Eleanor had come to me from her sickbed and accused our only child of grand larceny, I would have demanded alternative explanations. I would have assumed Eleanor was confused by the heavy narcotics. I would have tried to find a way to protect Sophia. Eleanor knew my weaknesses better than I knew them myself. She knew that a dying woman's accusation would not be enough to break my paternal delusion. She knew I needed to see the math. I needed to see the undeniable structural failure of my family in black and white ink. So, she carried the terrible burden of this knowledge entirely alone. She spent her final days suffering not just from the physical agony of her disease, but from the profound psychological torment of watching her daughter rob us. She endured that pain to compile a flawless evidentiary record, ensuring that when the time finally came, I would have no choice but to face the absolute truth. She had hidden the key in her necklace because she knew Sophia was impatient. She knew that once she was dead, Sophia and Henry would eventually make a mistake. They would get greedy. They would try to liquidate the final assets, and the necklace would inevitably end up in a pawn shop. Eleanor had engineered a scenario where their own arrogance would lead me directly to this vault. I turned to the final page of the ledger. It was not a spreadsheet. It was a summary written a mere 4 days before she passed away. The handwriting was slightly weaker, but the intent was absolute. "They forged your signature, William," she wrote. "They initiated a massive draw against the house. I caught it, I stopped it, but they will try again when I am gone. You cannot save her anymore. You have to save yourself. I closed the ledger. The soft thud of the leather cover hitting the table sounded like a gavel falling. The man who had walked into this bank 30 minutes ago was a grieving father, desperate to cling to the illusion of his family. That man no longer existed. My wife had used her dying breaths to construct a shield around me. She had handed me the exact tools required to dismantle the parasites who had invaded my home. I placed the ledger carefully under my arm. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel the urge to weep for the daughter I had lost. That emotional weakness had been surgically excised the moment I read Eleanor's final words. I felt a supreme mechanical focus. Henry and Sophia believed they had successfully executed a long con. They believed they were currently flying toward a luxury vacation funded by my ignorance. They had no idea that they had just triggered a fail-safe designed by a woman far smarter than they could ever hope to be. I walked out of the viewing room. It was time to close the trap. I turned the heavy parchment page of the ledger, and the columns of numbers abruptly stopped. In their place was a folded photocopy of a bank document securely taped to the binding. I flattened the paper against the polished wooden table. The stark black ink revealed a home equity line of credit. The registered amount made the air in the small viewing room feel instantly heavy. $150,000 had been borrowed against the house I had built with my own hands. I stared at the bottom of the document where the authorization signatures were required. My name was signed in blue ink. The cursive loops and sharp angles perfectly mimicked my distinct handwriting. But as an engineer who has spent a lifetime measuring microscopic tolerances, I saw the hesitation in the strokes. I saw the slight unnatural variation in the pen pressure that proved the signature was an absolute forgery. The backstory dripped into my mind like cold water. When Sophia was a teenager, she used to forge my signature on her report cards to hide her failing grades. I had caught her once and dismissed it as a harmless act of adolescent rebellion. I never imagined that 30 years later, she would weaponize that exact same skill to steal my home. But Sophia lacked the administrative knowledge to process a loan of this magnitude without triggering automated fraud alerts. Henry did not. My son-in-law had worked as a junior loan officer for a regional bank before being quietly terminated 3 years ago. Henry knew exactly how the digital approval systems functioned. He knew exactly which security protocols to bypass and which digital forms to submit to ensure the equity line was approved without a single phone call ever reaching my house. Eleanor had uncovered this massive theft while her body was systematically shutting down from the cancer. She had used her fading energy to track every stolen dollar. The subsequent pages of her ledger documented the horrific truth of where the money had gone. It did not go toward a medical emergency or a struggling business venture. The stolen equity paid for the luxury sedan currently sitting in my driveway. It paid for the designer clothes Sophia had shoved into her suitcase an hour ago. They had literally mortgaged the roof over my head to finance an illusion of wealth. They had assumed Eleanor would take her suspicions to the grave and that I would remain completely oblivious until the bank inevitably moved to foreclose on my property. But Eleanor was not merely a victim. She was a forensic auditor who understood that exposing a parasite is useless unless you simultaneously sever its food supply. I turned to the final section of the leather-bound book. Taped securely to the back cover was a legally binding mandate stamped with a heavy gold notary seal. It was dated exactly 4 days before her heart stopped. Eleanor had not simply documented the felony, she had amputated the infected limb. The document was an ironclad transfer of assets, utilizing a dormant legal provision we had established decades ago to protect our assets from liability. She had quietly liquidated our remaining joint accounts, our stock portfolios, and the unencumbered remainder of our estate. She had funneled every single cent we owned into a blind trust. The parameters of the trust were ruthless and magnificent. I read the legal stipulations with a growing sense of awe. Sophia and Henry were explicitly named and entirely excluded. They could not access a single dime. Furthermore, the trust was structured to automatically freeze all existing credit lines and trigger a catastrophic legal audit of the forged equity loan the moment I executed the final signature. Eleanor had built a financial guillotine, suspended it directly over their necks, and hidden the rope where only I could find it. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly locked together with terrifying clarity. This was why Henry had been willing to pay a stranger $3, zero to incinerate the contents of a pawn necklace. Sophia had not stolen her mother's medallion simply to pay for margaritas in Cabo. She might have convinced herself of that convenient lie, but Henry knew the absolute truth. Henry knew Eleanor had been auditing their lives. He knew she had caught them committing wire fraud and forgery. He knew she had left a map behind. He had ordered Sophia to steal the necklace because he believed the key to their salvation was hidden inside it. He thought that burning the key would bury the evidence forever, allowing them to walk away with my stolen equity. He was completely wrong. The evidence was not in the pendant. The pendant was merely the gateway to the vault. By orchestrating the theft of the necklace to cover his tracks, Henry had inadvertently forced me to find the exact weapon my wife had forged to destroy them. If they had simply left the necklace in my locked drawer, I might have spent months mourning in ignorance while they drained the final drops of my livelihood. Their own arrogant greed had sealed their fate. I closed the leather-bound ledger. The soft thud of the cover hitting the table echoed in the quiet room. The heavy, paralyzing grief that had anchored me to the floor for the past 3 weeks completely evaporated. It was replaced by a profound and terrifying calm. I had walked into this bank as a mourning father, trying to salvage a memory. I was walking out with an airtight case of felony forgery and wire fraud. My daughter and my son-in-law were currently settling into their first-class seats, completely unaware that the financial ground beneath them had just crumbled into dust. I stood up from the wooden table and tucked the heavy ledger under my arm. The time for sorrow was permanently over. It was time to execute Eleanor's final directive. I stepped out of the small viewing room with the heavy leather ledger tucked firmly under my right arm. The cold air of the vault corridor washed over my face, but I barely registered the temperature. The profound grief that had been my constant companion for the past 3 weeks was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a singular mechanical focus. My wife had not just left me a note of warning, she had left me a loaded weapon and the explicit coordinates of my enemies. I walked down the long hallway toward the main lobby, where the senior vault manager was waiting for me. He stood up from his mahogany desk as I approached. His eyes briefly flicked down to the black ledger, but he maintained his practiced professional neutrality. He asked if everything was in order. I stopped directly in front of his desk. I told him everything was perfectly in order. My tone left absolutely no room for pleasantries. I told him I needed to use his private office immediately and that I needed a secure telephone line. The manager did not hesitate. He recognized the shift in my demeanor. The quiet morning widower who had walked into the bank was gone. In his place was a retired civil engineer who had just discovered a catastrophic structural failure in his own family and was moving to isolate the collapse. The manager guided me past the teller stations and unlocked a heavy oak door that led to a soundproof executive suite. He motioned toward a large leather chair and a multi-line telephone resting on a polished glass desk. He told me he would ensure I was not disturbed and stepped backward out of the room. He closed the door quietly behind him. The sudden silence of the office enveloped me. I sat down in the leather chair and placed Eleanor's ledger flat on the glass surface. I opened it to the final page, where she had taped the forged equity line document. I picked up the receiver and dialed a phone number I had known for over 2 decades. It was the direct personal line for Arthur Camden. Camden was a ruthless corporate attorney who had represented my construction firm during our most aggressive expansion periods. He was a man who understood the precise application of legal force. He was also a close personal friend who had always respected Eleanor's fierce intellect. The line rang exactly twice before he answered. He spoke his name with a sharp, impatient tone. I told him it was William Vance. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The impatience immediately vanished from his voice. He told me he was deeply sorry to hear about Eleanor, and that he had intended to call me later this week. I told him I appreciated the sentiment, but we did not have time for condolences today. I explained that I was sitting inside the main downtown branch of my bank. I told him I had just opened a secure lockbox that Eleanor established 18 months ago. I told him she had left me a comprehensive financial ledger and a series of legal directives. The silence stretched for a long moment before Camden spoke again. He asked me exactly what Eleanor had found. I told him she found a massive sustained wire fraud operation. My voice was completely devoid of any emotion. I explained that Sophia and Henry had been systematically siphoning my secondary accounts for 8 months. I told him they forged my signature on a $150,000 home equity line of credit. Camden let out a long, heavy breath. He did not ask if I was sure. He knew Eleanor, and he knew her professional pedigree. He stated that if Eleanor documented it, then it was absolute fact. His voice hardened into a tactical edge. He told me we needed to notify the federal authorities because this was a severe felony. I told him we would notify the authorities eventually, but right now we needed to execute the fail-safe Eleanor design. I explained how she had liquidated our joint holdings and the unencumbered remainder of the estate. I told him she had transferred everything into a blind trust 4 days before she died. I heard the sound of papers shuffling on Camden's desk. He was already pulling up my file. He repeated the words blind trust, and his tone was laced with sudden, profound respect. He said it was a brilliant defensive maneuver because it effectively walled off the capital from any familial claims. I agreed with him. I told him the trust required my final authorization signature to activate its enforcement protocols. I instructed him to initiate the total financial freeze right now. I told him I needed every credit line severed. I needed the equity draw halted immediately, and I needed Melanie's name permanently scrubbed as an authorized user from every single account registered to my name. I told him I would not allow them to extract another dime. Camden began typing rapidly on his keyboard. The mechanical clicking echoed through the receiver. He stated he was generating the emergency injunctions right now. He told me he could send the digital authorization portals directly to my phone. He explained that once I signed the electronic waivers, he would have me patch the vault manager into the call. He said we would bypass the standard review periods by executing the freeze directly at the branch management level. He marveled at how perfectly Eleanor had structured the trap. He explained that the moment my signature hit the trust ledger, the bank was legally obligated to lock down the compromised accounts to prevent further liability. My phone vibrated on the glass desk. A secure email notification appeared on the screen containing the legal transfer documents Camden had just drafted. I opened the file and read through the strict, unyielding parameters my wife had secretly constructed. Sophia and Henry were explicitly named and permanently excluded from any future financial access. The language was bulletproof. I pressed my finger against the digital signature line sealing the trap. The documents transmitted back to Camden instantly. He confirmed he had my authorization. He told me to put the branch manager on the line. I stood up and walked to the office door. I opened it and signaled to the vault manager, who was waiting discreetly down the hall. He approached quickly and entered the office. I handed him the telephone receiver and told him my attorney required his immediate compliance to execute an emergency asset freeze. The manager listened intently for several minutes. His eyes widened as Camden outlined the legal reality of the forged equity loan and the activation of the blind trust. The manager spoke with complete deference, stating he would initiate the lockdown protocol immediately. The manager placed the phone on speaker and turned to his computer terminal. He began entering authorization codes with rapid, frantic keystrokes. I stood behind him, watching the screens reflect the total dismantling of my daughter's financial supply lines. First, the joint checking accounts were flagged and frozen. The system registered an immediate zero balance for any secondary debit cards. Then, the manager moved to the credit lines. I watched as the authorization statuses for Sophia and Henry were permanently revoked. Their access credentials were systematically deleted from the main banking servers. Their plastic cards were instantly transformed into useless pieces of garbage. Finally, the manager accessed the pending home equity line of credit. The $150 Zirin draw that Henry had so carefully engineered was currently sitting in a holding status, waiting for the final clearing process. The manager highlighted the transaction and initiated a hard fraud stop. The transfer was abruptly canceled. The funds were locked down pending a full internal security audit. The digital guillotine had fallen with absolute surgical precision. Every pipeline of illicit wealth had been completely severed. The manager stepped back from the terminal and announced that it was done. He confirmed that every account associated with those names had been completely blocked. He explained they could not withdraw cash and they could not process credit transactions. He stated the equity loan was entirely dead. He added that if they attempted to use any cards associated with this institution, the transaction would automatically decline and trigger a fraud alert to law enforcement. I thanked the manager and picked up the phone. I asked Arthur if he had heard the confirmation. Camden replied that he had heard it and that my assets were fully secure. He said the bleed had been permanently stopped. He asked me what my next move would be. I told him my next move was simply to wait. My voice was cold and perfectly steady. I explained that Henry and Sophia were currently on a commercial flight heading to a luxury beach resort. They believed they had successfully stolen my livelihood. They were sipping cocktails in the sky, completely convinced of their own untouchable superiority. But in a few hours their plane was going to land. They were going to step off that flight and approach a rental car counter or a hotel concierge. They would confidently hand over a stolen credit card, and they were going to discover that they possessed absolutely nothing. Their entire financial foundation had been completely vaporized while they were suspended in the clouds. I hung up the phone and gathered Eleanor's heavy leather ledger. I walked out of the bank with my head held high. The quiet, grieving widower was gone forever. I was an engineer who had just restored the integrity of his structure. The trap had violently snapped shut. The real reckoning had begun. The heavy brass of the old front door lock hit the bottom of the metal toolbox with a dull and satisfying clatter. I knelt on the hardwood floor of my entryway, wiping a smear of graphite grease from my thumb. The house was completely silent. It was the deep, resonant silence of a structure that had finally been purged of a slow-moving poison. I picked up the screwdriver and aligned the heavy steel plate of the new deadbolt. I had driven straight to a local hardware store immediately after leaving the bank. I purchased the absolute most expensive high-security lock sets they carried. I was not a man who ever left loose ends. Henry and Sophia still possessed keys to the original locks. They believed this house was their ultimate safety net, their guaranteed inheritance, and their personal piggy bank. I was meticulously and physically dismantling that illusion screw by steel screw. I drove the final long screw deep into the reinforced door frame. The metal bit into the solid wood, anchoring the lock permanently into place. I stood up and tested the mechanism. The deadbolt slid forward with a heavy metallic thud, snapping securely into the strike plate. The barrier was absolute. Just as I turned the latch back to the open position, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the wooden surface of the console table. The buzzing sound shattered the quiet peace of the hallway. I did not need to look at the illuminated screen to know exactly who was calling. The trap I had armed with Arthur Camden less than 3 hours ago was a precision instrument. It was perfectly designed to detonate the very moment they attempted to access their stolen wealth. I walked over to the table and picked up the device. The caller identification displayed my daughter's name. I pressed the green button to accept the call and raised the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply breathed in the quiet air of my newly secured home and listened to the fallout. The audio that poured out of the speaker was absolute chaos. I could hear the loud, echoing acoustics of a massive marble lobby. Over the background noise of cascading water features and tropical resort music, a cacophony of panicked voices competed for dominance. I heard a man speaking rapid and aggressive Spanish. I heard the distinct sound of luggage wheels scraping sharply across a polished floor. And cutting through it all was the shrill, terrified pitch of my daughter's voice. "Dad, you have to help us." Sophia screamed into the phone. Her voice was breathy and frantic, entirely stripped of her usual arrogant entitlement. "Dad, please tell me you are there. We are in Mexico, and everything is completely falling apart. You have to call the bank right now." I leaned against the console table, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. I asked her what the problem was. My tone was flat and entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. I sounded exactly like a stranger taking a survey. My emotional detachment did not register with her. She was far too consumed by her own immediate catastrophe. "The cards are declining," she yelled over the noise of the lobby. "Every single one of them. The joint debit card, the platinum credit line, even the emergency backup cards. We tried to check into the resort, and the front desk manager swiped them 6 times. They are all coming up as fraudulent and locked. Dad, the manager, is standing right in front of us holding our passports. He says the authorization network flagged our names. He is demanding a cash payment for the entire week, plus the security deposit. Or he is going to call the local police for attempted theft of services." I listened to Henry shouting in the background. I could hear his arrogant voice cracking with genuine fear as he tried to argue with the Mexican hotel staff. He was attempting to use his old banking terminology to intimidate the resort manager, loudly demanding that they run the numbers through a secondary terminal. He was a coward trying to bluster his way out of a trap he did not yet understand. "Dad, you need to log into the portal and fix this bank error," Sophia pleaded. She was crying now, the tears making her voice thick and wet. "Henry thinks there is a security hold because we are out of the country. Just call the fraud department and authorize the release. Please, Dad. They are threatening to throw us out into the street. We do not have any cash. We cannot even pay for a taxi back to the airport. They have our bags. You have to wire us money right now, or pay them over the phone." I let her finish. I let the full weight of her desperate, humiliating situation hang in the air between us. I wanted her to feel the absolute terror of being stranded in a foreign country, stripped of the stolen armor she had worn for so long. I looked at the new shiny deadbolt on my front door. "There is no bank error, Sophia," I stated clearly. My voice sliced through the chaotic noise of the resort lobby like a surgical scalpel. I did not raise my pitch. I did not yell. I spoke with the calm, undeniable authority of a judge delivering a final verdict. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second. The background noise of the hotel seemed to fade as my words registered in her panicked mind. "What do you mean there is no error?" she stammered. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. "Dad, the cards are canceled. They told us the accounts do not even exist anymore." "The accounts exist," I replied, "but your access to them has been permanently eradicated." I sat down in the bank manager's office 3 hours ago with a very specific brass key. I opened a secure vault box that your mother established 18 months ago. I retrieved a black leather ledger. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The crying completely stopped. The sudden, terrifying realization paralyzed her. She knew exactly what that black leather ledger meant. She knew that the impenetrable wall of lies she and Henry had built was collapsing around them. "Your mother was a brilliant woman, Sophia," I continued. "She spent her final agonizing months auditing every single anomaly in our financial portfolio. She tracked every dollar you and your husband siphoned from my savings. She documented every time you offered to help with the household bills just to intercept the bank statements. She built a flawless evidentiary chain." "Dad, please," Sophia whispered. Her voice was barely a fraction of its former volume. It was the sound of a trapped animal realizing the cage door had permanently locked. "Henry said. Henry told me he had it under control. He said he took care of the necklace." "Henry is a parasite and a fool," I stated coldly. "He sent a thug to a pawn shop today to buy a silver pendant, believing he could simply erase a federal crime with $3,000 in cash, but he was too late. I already possessed the key. And more importantly, Eleanor had already engaged the fail-safe. 4 days before she died, she legally transferred every unencumbered asset I own into a blind trust. A trust that explicitly excludes you and your husband. A trust that automatically triggered a total financial freeze the moment I initiated the protocol." "Dad, we can explain." Sophia sobbed. "We were desperate. Henry had debts. We were going to pay you back. We were going to figure it out. Please do not do this to us. We are in another country. We have nothing. They are going to arrest us. You are not going to be arrested by the local resort police, Sophia." I told her the hotel manager will eventually realize he cannot extract blood from a stone. He will confiscate your luggage as collateral, and he will throw you out into the street. You will have to walk to the consulate. You will have to beg for a provisional repatriation flight back to the United States, and when you finally land on American soil, your real problems will begin." "What do you mean?" she asked. Her voice was trembling so violently the phone microphone rattled. "I mean the $150,000 home equity line of credit," I replied. "I mean the digital forgery Henry executed using your access credentials. I mean the massive felony wire fraud you committed against your own parents while your mother was dying in her bed." I did not just freeze the account, Sophia. I handed Eleanor's ledger directly to my corporate attorney. "Arthur Camden is currently submitting the fraud packet to the federal authorities." "No," Sophia screamed, a raw, guttural sound of absolute devastation. "Dad, you cannot do this. I am your daughter. You cannot send us to prison. I am your only child. You stopped being my daughter the moment you decided. My home was nothing but collateral for your luxury vacation. I stated you stole from a dying woman. You banked on my grief keeping me blind. You thought you could gut my foundation and walk away. But you forgot that I spent 40 years building structures designed to withstand catastrophic pressure. I know how to reinforce a load-bearing wall, and I know how to demolish a condemned property. Dad, please," she begged over and over again. "You have to stop this. You have to save us. I am begging you." I looked at the shiny new keys resting on the console table. They belonged to the heavy steel deadbolts I had just installed. They represented the permanent physical boundary between my new life and their toxic greed. "Save yourselves," I said. I ended the call. I did not wait for her final sob. I pressed the red button and severed the connection. The phone went completely dark in my hand. The quiet peace of the hallway immediately returned. The chaos of the Mexican resort, the pathetic pleading of a thief, the frantic shouting of a coward. They were all instantly erased from my atmosphere. I placed the phone gently on the table next to the new keys. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had crushed them completely. I stood in the silent entryway of my secure home, feeling a profound and unshakable sense of justice. Eleanor's final masterpiece was complete. The parasites had been excised. I was finally truly free. The moment I severed the connection, the chaotic sounds of the crowded Mexican resort lobby vanished. The desperate pleading of my daughter, the angry shouting of my son-in-law, and the demands of the hotel management were completely silenced. I stood in the quiet hallway of my home and stared at the dark screen of my phone. I felt a profound sense of finality. A lesser man might have wept at the destruction of his family, but a lifetime of engineering had taught me a harsh truth. When a structure is fundamentally compromised by rot, you do not mourn its collapse. You clear the debris and you rebuild on solid ground. I walked into my home office and turned on the brass desk lamp. The warm light spilled across the polished oak surface, illuminating Eleanor's black leather ledger. I opened the heavy cover and turned to the section documenting the forged home equity line. Henry was a coward, but a cornered coward facing federal prosecution is the most dangerous variable in any equation. He knew the bank accounts were frozen. He knew his massive theft had been discovered, but digital evidence could be tied up in court for years by a competent defense attorney. Henry needed to eliminate the physical proof. I read my wife's meticulous notes. Eleanor had dedicated an entire page to the chain of custody regarding the fraudulent contracts. Henry had not kept the paperwork at his own apartment. He was far too paranoid for that. He had intercepted the original bank documents from my mailbox and buried them in the bottom drawer of my own steel filing cabinet by mixing the forged contracts in with 40 years of my legitimate tax returns and architectural blueprints. He had created a perfect alibi. If the fraud was ever investigated, the documents would be found in my physical possession, making it appear as though I had initiated the loan myself. I sat down at the computer monitor on my desk. Eleanor had not merely audited the bank accounts. As a senior forensic investigator, she understood that financial criminals inevitably panic when their supply lines are severed, and panic always leaves a digital trail. She had painstakingly bypassed the security protocols on Henry's cellular provider account and documented the passwords in the back of her ledger. I typed the complex sequence of characters into the login portal. The screen refreshed, and I was immediately granted access to his real-time messaging logs. The digital feed was rapidly updating. Henry was spiraling into absolute desperation. I watched the text messages populate on the glowing screen. He was communicating with a local cellular number back here in the States. Eleanor had already identified the number in her marginalia. It belonged to a man named Marcus Vance. Marcus was a former repossession agent who had worked with Henry during his brief, failed stint as a loan officer. Marcus was the blunt physical instrument Henry deployed when intimidation was required. I read the frantic messages pouring in from the foreign resort. Henry was typing with terrifying urgency. The old man found the lockbox. The accounts are completely frozen. He knows about the equity line. You have to get into the house tonight. The responses from Marcus were brief and irritated. He asked what exactly Henry wanted him to do. Henry replied with absolute clarity. He ordered Marcus to breach my back door. He told him to go directly to the home office and empty the bottom drawer of the gray filing cabinet. He explicitly commanded Marcus to burn every single document he found inside. Henry promised to wire him $10 the very moment the physical evidence was destroyed. He assured Marcus that I was just a tired old man who went to sleep at 9 every night. He promised it would be the easiest money Marcus ever made. I sat in the glow of the monitor and read the final confirmation from Marcus stating he would arrive at my property by midnight. I glanced at the digital clock in the corner of the screen. It was currently 8:45 in the evening. I had exactly 3 hours and 15 minutes to prepare my environment for a violent home invasion. Henry thought I would be cowering under my bed covers, weeping over the loss of my daughter. He vastly underestimated the man whose house he was attempting to breach. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the tall gray filing cabinet in the corner of the room. I pulled open the bottom drawer. The metal tracks groaned loudly under the weight of decades of paperwork. I reached past the thick folders containing my old engineering schematics and found a heavy manila envelope shoved all the way to the back. I pulled it out and opened the metal clasp. Inside were the original loan origination documents for the $150,000 equity line. I stared at the blue ink on the signature line. The forgery was clumsy upon close inspection. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of Henry's felony. I slid the documents back into the envelope. I did not leave them in the drawer. I carried the envelope into the kitchen and sealed it inside a waterproof silicone bag. I lifted the heavy cast-iron grate covering the floor vent of the central heating system and dropped the bag deep down into the dark metal ductwork. The physical evidence was entirely secure. I returned to the office and closed the empty filing cabinet drawer. I needed to control the precise parameters of the impending breach. In structural engineering, you cannot always prevent a collapse, but you can absolutely dictate exactly where the debris will fall. I walked through the house, turning off every single light. The interior plunged into absolute darkness. I drew the heavy curtains across the front windows, blocking out the pale orange glow of the street lamps. I moved to the rear of the house. The kitchen faced a deep wooded lot that provided perfect cover for an intruder. Henry had instructed Marcus to use the back door. I walked over to the kitchen entrance. It was a solid, heavy wooden door with a small square window near the top. I reached into my toolbox and retrieved a heavy roll of industrial adhesive tape and a thick sheet of black construction plastic. I carefully taped the plastic over the small window, ensuring that not a single photon of ambient moonlight could penetrate the kitchen. I created a perfectly blind environment. I checked the new deadbolt I had installed just hours ago. The hardened steel was virtually impenetrable. Marcus would not be able to pick this lock quietly. He would be forced to use brute kinetic energy. He would have to break the glass or kick the door off its heavy hinges. He would make noise. He would announce his arrival. I reached back into the toolbox and pulled out a solid steel heavy-duty pipe wrench. The metal felt cold and perfectly balanced in my grip. I opened the tall pantry closet near the refrigerator. It provided a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the back door and the narrow entryway of the home office. I stepped inside the dark pantry and left the door open just a few inches. I settled into the deep shadows. My breathing was slow and measured. I did not feel any fear. Fear is a biological response to the unknown. I knew exactly who was coming. I knew exactly what he wanted, and I knew exactly how I was going to stop him. The hours ticked by in absolute silence. The house settled around me, the wooden floorboards occasionally creaking as the night air cooled the structure. I sat perfectly still in the darkness, gripping the heavy steel wrench. My mind drifted briefly to Eleanor. I thought about the staggering amount of pain she must have endured to compile that ledger. I thought about the cold, lonely nights she spent typing those access codes while the cancer ate away at her bones. She had given her last ounce of strength to protect me from the vultures feeding on our family. I was not going to let her sacrifice be in vain. At exactly 12:14 in the morning, the motion sensor light on the back patio suddenly illuminated. A faint yellow outline leaked through the edges of the black plastic taped over the door window. I stopped, breathing. The quiet crunch of heavy boots stepping onto the wooden deck vibrated through the floor joists. The intruder had arrived. A dark silhouette passed in front of the blocked window. I heard the soft metallic scrape of a tool testing the perimeter of the doorframe. Marcus was probing for a weakness. He quickly discovered the heavy-duty deadbolt I had just installed. A low, frustrated curse drifted through the solid wood. Henry had promised him an easy job. He had promised him an unlocked door and a sleeping old man. Marcus was currently discovering the first of many structural miscalculations. The scraping stopped, the silence returned for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the entire house shook. A massive blunt force slammed into the exterior of the back door. The heavy wood groaned under the impact, but the steel strike plate held firm. Marcus had decided to abandon stealth. He was using his shoulder to batter the entrance. He struck the door a second time. The frame splintered and the glass window shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The black plastic tore open, letting the harsh glare of the patio light flood into the kitchen. I stood motionless in the shadows of the pantry, gripping the steel wrench tightly in my right hand. I watched as a large gloved hand reached through the broken glass and blindly searched for the deadbolt latch. The trap was perfectly set. The thief was inside the perimeter. The silent reckoning Eleanor had orchestrated was about to become devastatingly loud. The heavy crash of shattered glass echoed through the dark kitchen as the back door window finally gave way. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the open pantry, holding the heavy steel wrench at my side. I did not hold the weapon to strike the man attempting to breach my home. I held it simply as a grounding mechanism to keep my hands steady and my mind focused. I was a retired structural engineer, and I understood that you never rely on a single point of failure. I had not chosen to face a desperate criminal alone. My corporate attorney, Arthur Camden, was a man of immense influence, and he had not wasted a single minute after our phone call. While I was taping black plastic over the door window, Arthur had contacted the local precinct commander. Because we already possessed documented evidence of a federal wire fraud operation, the police did not treat this as a standard noise complaint. They treated it as the active destruction of physical evidence in an ongoing felony investigation. Less than an hour before the intruder arrived, 2 local detectives from the Financial Crimes and Burglary Division had parked their unmarked vehicle 2 streets over. They had walked through the wooded lot behind my property and entered my home through the front door. Detective Miller and Detective Hayes were currently standing in absolute silence in the adjacent dining room. Their service weapons were drawn and resting at their sides. We were not hoping to scare the intruder away. We were executing a perfectly coordinated trap to catch him completely red-handed. A large gloved hand reached through the jagged hole in the back door window. The thick black plastic tore further as the intruder blindly searched for the interior lock. I could hear his heavy breathing through the wooden panels. He found the new deadbolt I had installed just hours earlier. The mechanism was unfamiliar, and he fumbled with the heavy steel latch for several agonizing seconds before finally managing to turn it. The heavy deadbolt slid back with a loud metallic click. The brass handle turned, and the back door was pushed open. The damp night air flowed into the kitchen, carrying the smell of crushed pine needles and wet earth. The intruder stepped over the threshold. He was a large man wearing dark industrial clothing and a heavy hooded jacket. He closed the broken door behind him as quietly as he could to avoid alerting the neighbors. He pulled a small tactical flashlight from his pocket. He turned it on, using a red light filter to keep the beam weak and narrow. The red glow swept across the kitchen floor, illuminating the shattered glass and the edge of the refrigerator. The man moved with practiced confidence. He did not check the bedrooms upstairs, and he did not search the living room for valuables. He was a mercenary on a very specific mission. He walked right past the open pantry, completely unaware that I was standing less than 3 feet away from his shoulder. He headed directly toward the hallway that led to my home office. I stepped out of the pantry and moved silently into the kitchen. I looked toward the dining room and saw Detective Miller raise his hand, signaling me to wait. We needed the intruder to commit to the specific act of destroying the files. We listened to the heavy boots walk down the short corridor and enter the office. I heard the unmistakable metallic groan of the gray filing cabinet as he pulled the bottom drawer open on its rusted tracks. The sound of shuffling paper echoed down the hall as he began frantically tearing through my architectural blueprints and tax returns, looking for the forged bank documents. The trap had reached its critical threshold. I walked calmly toward the hallway and stopped at the main electrical panel on the wall. I placed my hand flat against the heavy plastic switches. I waited for 2 more seconds, listening to the man ripping folders apart in the dark. Then I pushed the main breaker switch upward. The entire back half of the house was instantly flooded with blinding overhead light. The sudden brightness was violent and absolute. I stepped into the doorway of the home office. The man was kneeling on the hardwood floor, surrounded by scattered papers and empty manila envelopes. He froze completely, clutching a handful of old utility bills. The red light of his flashlight looked pathetic and dim under the bright ceiling bulbs. He turned his head and looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. Before he could even register my presence, Detective Miller and Detective Hayes stepped into the doorway, flanking me on both sides. They raised their weapons and pointed them directly at the center of the intruder's chest. Detective Miller issued a loud and commanding order. He told the man to drop the papers and place his hands flat on the floor. The intruder did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He was a career criminal who instantly recognized the absolute futility of his situation. He dropped the utility bills and threw his hands out in front of him. Detective Hayes stepped forward and pushed the mouse down onto his stomach. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists, binding his hands securely behind his back. The physical threat was entirely neutralized in less than 10 seconds. The intruder lay on the floor, breathing heavily and sweating profusely. His name was Marcus, and he understood the brutal mathematics of the judicial system. He knew that breaking and entering an occupied dwelling during the night was a severe felony. He knew he was facing a mandatory minimum prison sentence that would cost him years of his life. Panic completely consumed him. He turned his head and looked up at the detectives. He began speaking before they even had a chance to read him his rights. Marcus shouted that he did not want to hurt anyone and that he was only hired to do a job. He swore he did not even know the homeowner. He stated repeatedly that a man named Henry Vance had offered him $10,000 to break into the house and burn a specific set of bank documents. He babbled frantically, trying to build an immediate defense by shifting the entire weight of the crime onto his employer. He begged the detectives to check his cellular phone, which was sitting in the front pocket of his jacket. He told them the phone contained a dozen text messages from Henry, proving that the entire burglary was ordered and financed from a resort in Mexico. Detective Hayes knelt down and retrieved the device from the jacket pocket. He placed the phone inside a clear plastic evidence bag. The digital trailhead uncovered in her ledger was now physically secured in police custody. I stood in the doorway and looked down at the pathetic man writhing on my floor. I told Marcus that the bank documents Henry had sent him to destroy were no longer in the filing cabinet. I explained that the original forged contracts were currently resting at the bottom of a steel ventilation shaft, and that copies had already been forwarded to a federal prosecutor. I told him in a calm and steady voice that Henry had sent him on a suicide mission to burn a pile of blank paper. The realization washed over Marcus. He dropped his head against the floorboards, letting out a long groan of defeat. He knew Henry had played him for a fool. Detective Miller pulled Marcus to his feet and led him out of the office toward the kitchen. I sat the handcuffed man down at my dining room table. Detective Hayes pulled out a formal statement pad and placed it on the wood. He told Marcus that if he wanted the district attorney to show him any leniency, he needed to document every single detail of the arrangement right now. Marcus did not need to be asked twice. The survival instinct of a mercenary is entirely selfish. Over the next 45 minutes, he detailed the entire conspiracy. He explained how Henry had called him in an absolute panic, screaming that the bank accounts had been frozen and that the old man had found the ledger. He dictated the exact dollar amounts he was promised and the specific instructions he was given regarding the destruction of the files. The detective wrote down every word. When the statement was complete, Marcus signed his name at the bottom of the page, acknowledging his role in the crime and explicitly naming my son-in-law as the mastermind. I stood in the kitchen and watched the detectives escort Marcus out through the front door and into the back of a waiting patrol car. The flashing lights illuminated the quiet suburban street, casting long shadows across my lawn. Detective Miller handed me a carbon copy of the signed confession. He told me the district attorney would be filing additional charges in the morning. I held the piece of paper in my hand. Henry had desperately tried to execute a countermeasure to save himself. Instead, his blind panic had handed me the ultimate weapon. I now possessed undeniable evidence of wire fraud, identity theft, and a signed confession for conspiracy to commit burglary. My daughter and her husband were currently sitting in a foreign country without a single dollar to their names. They were entirely stripped of their resources and surrounded by a legal firestorm they could not possibly extinguish. The foundation of their arrogant entitlement had been demolished. I placed the confession on the kitchen counter next to my heavy steel wrench and began sweeping up the broken glass. The silent reckoning was almost complete. 3 days had passed since the local detectives escorted a handcuffed mercenary out of my kitchen. The shattered glass from my back door had been swept away and replaced with a solid sheet of reinforced security glass. I spent those 72 hours meticulously fortifying the physical perimeter of my home. I changed every exterior lock and installed high-resolution motion cameras along the roofline. I was sitting at the dining room table, drinking a cup of black coffee, when the newly installed perimeter alarm chimed softly on my cellular phone. I looked at the live video feed on the screen. A battered yellow taxi had just violently pulled up to the curb in front of my house. The rear doors of the cab opened, and Sophia and Henry climbed out onto the pavement. I watched them through the digital monitor. They looked entirely devoid of their usual polished arrogance. The designer linen clothing they had packed for their luxury Mexican vacation was hopelessly wrinkled and stained with dark patches of sweat. Their posture was heavy and exhausted. I noticed immediately that the thick gold watches they perpetually wore to signal their wealth were missing from their wrists. They had clearly been forced upon their own jewelry just to secure a budget commercial flight back to the United States. They had been expelled from their tropical paradise and dropped directly into a brutal financial reality. They did not walk up my driveway with the hesitant steps of children coming to apologize for a catastrophic mistake. They marched toward my front porch with aggressive and heavy strides. They were cornered predators driven by absolute desperation. Walked to the front entryway. I opened the heavy front door before they even had a chance to ring the bell. I stood squarely in the threshold, creating an immovable physical barrier between them and my home. Henry did not offer a greeting or a single word of apology. He immediately thrust a thick manila folder toward my chest. His face was red and contorted with rage. He loudly demanded that I hand over the keys to the house right this second. His voice echoed across the quiet suburban lawn. Sophia stood directly behind him, with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. She had convinced herself that I was the villain in this scenario. A third person suddenly stepped out from behind a large oak tree in my front yard and joined them on the porch. It was a man in his late 50s wearing a cheap gray suit and carrying a scuffed leather briefcase. Henry pointed to the stranger and introduced him as a professional medical evaluator. The man in the suit attempted a reassuring professional smile, but it looked entirely synthetic and strained. He stated his name was Dr. Albright and that he was here to conduct an emergency wellness check at the request of my concerned children. Dr. Albright opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of fraudulent guardianship papers. He claimed his office had received urgent reports that I had shown significant changes in my financial behavior and that I had irrationally cut off all communication with my family. He looked at the new deadbolt on my front door and stated that installing unnecessary security systems was a classic symptom of severe paranoia. He spoke with a condescending tone designed to make me sound like a mentally disturbed old man, incapable of managing my own life. Henry stepped forward and aggressively invaded my personal space. He pointed his finger directly at my face. He loudly declared that my sudden decision to freeze their bank accounts and lock down the estate was absolute proof of aggressive dementia. He claimed my grief over Eleanor's death was making me imagine things and that it was common for older people to develop senile paranoia after losing a partner. Henry stated that I was a danger to myself and my assets. He demanded the house keys again, insisting that I was going to be relocated to a specialized retirement community by the end of the week. Salmo, the absolute audacity of their strategy crystallized in my mind. They had not returned to beg for forgiveness or negotiate a surrender. They had decided to double down on their criminality. They were attempting to declare me legally incompetent on the spot, to bypass the ironclad restrictions of the blind trust Eleanor had established. They wanted to seize legal guardianship over my physical person so they could drain my remaining wealth without any resistance. I felt a deep and freezing calm settle into my chest. I looked at the fake medical evaluator standing on my porch. I asked him in a perfectly flat voice to produce his medical license and his official court order. Dr. Albright hesitated and nervously glanced at Henry for support. The man stammered that he did not need a court mandate for a preliminary family assessment. He claimed my children had already signed a formal petition for guardianship based on my erratic behavior and that my cooperation was required. I turned my attention back to Henry. I told him his plan was incredibly foolish and completely transparent. I explained that I knew exactly how he had managed to get back from Cabo San Lucas. I pointed directly at his bare left wrist and mentioned the missing luxury watch. Sophia screamed that I had forced them to sell their personal property because I had maliciously and irrationally cut off their funds. She demanded that I sign the evaluation papers Dr. Albright was holding so they could reverse the bank freeze and restore order to the family. I told Sophia I would not sign a single document for the rest of my life. I explained that my corporate attorney, Arthur Camden, had completely anticipated this exact desperate maneuver. I looked at the man in the gray suit and informed him that he was actively participating in a federal conspiracy to commit medical document fraud. I told Dr. Albright that my legal team had already secured 3 independent psychiatric evaluations, confirming my perfect mental competence. The color rapidly drained from the fake doctor's face. He suddenly realized he had marched directly into a highly coordinated legal trap. Henry sneered and insisted my threats meant absolutely nothing. He claimed he had multiple witnesses who would testify under oath that I had completely lost my mind. He loudly demanded the house keys for a third time, insisting that he was taking control of the property right now. He stepped closer, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. I did take a single step backward. I reached into the interior pocket of my jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the carbon copy of the formal confession Marcus had signed at my dining room table 3 nights ago. I unfolded the document slowly and held it up so Henry could see the bold handwriting. I told Henry that his former repossession associate was currently sitting in a maximum security holding cell at the county jail. I watched Henry's arrogant posture completely shatter. His eyes darted wildly across the signed confession. I explained in a cold and methodical voice that Marcus had broken into my house through the back kitchen door, expecting to find the original forged equity documents hidden in my filing cabinet. I told Henry that 2 local burglary detectives had been waiting in the dark to arrest his associate. I explained that Marcus had provided a full written confession explicitly naming Henry as the mastermind who had hired him to destroy physical evidence. The absolute reality of his situation crashed down upon Henry. He began to hyperventilate. His face turned a sickly shade of gray as he processed the fact that he was now facing charges for conspiracy to commit burglary on top of federal wire fraud. Sophia turned and stared at her husband in pure, unadulterated horror. She had not known anything about the midnight break-in. Henry had kept that desperate and illegal countermeasure a complete secret, even from his own wife, to protect himself. The fractures in their alliance were immediately visible. Dr. Albright did not say another word. The uncredentialed evaluator slowly backed away from the porch and walked rapidly toward the street. He practically ran down the sidewalk, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a confirmed felony investigation. He abandoned his clients without a backward glance. I looked at my daughter and her husband standing frozen on my front steps. I told them the federal authorities were currently reviewing the forged signatures on the home equity line and that the local police were finalizing the burglary warrants. I spoke with absolute clarity, telling them they had sold her mother's legacy for a luxury vacation and that they would have to find their own way back from the destruction they had caused. I ordered them to get off my property immediately before I called the detectives who were waiting for my signal. They turned around and stumbled down the driveway in complete and utter silence. The aggressive predators who had stormed my porch just minutes earlier had been reduced to terrified fugitives. I stood in the doorway and watched them walk aimlessly down the suburban street without any luggage or any destination. I closed the heavy front door and locked the new steel deadbolt. I walked back toward the kitchen, feeling a profound sense of closure. But as I reached the dining room table, my cellular phone vibrated sharply against the wood. I picked it up and saw an incoming message from an unknown number. A new and entirely unexpected variable had just entered the equation. I looked down at the illuminated screen of my cellular phone. The message was not from a stranger. It was a secure text sent from Detective Miller. The detective was currently standing inside my formal dining room alongside Arthur Camden and Detective Hayes. They had arrived through the back alleyway while Henry and Sophia were screaming on my front porch. The message contained a very specific legal directive. Detective Miller instructed me to bring them back to the threshold and let them talk. He needed them to explicitly vocalize their conspiracy to establish a continuous chain of criminal intent. I slid the phone into my jacket pocket and placed my hand on the brass doorknob. I opened the heavy front door and stepped back out onto the porch. The cool evening air washed over my face. I looked down the long paved driveway. Henry and Sophia had nearly reached the sidewalk. They were walking with the heavy, dragging footsteps of defeated predators. I raised my voice and called out Henry's name. The sound echoed sharply against the quiet suburban houses. They both stopped instantly. They turned around and looked back up the driveway. Even from that distance, I could see the sudden shift in Henry's posture. The desperate panic that had consumed him just moments ago vanished. It was immediately replaced by a surge of arrogant triumph. He believed I had broken. He believed the threat of an uncredentialed medical evaluator, and the sheer weight of his intimidation had finally cracked my foundation. He thought I was calling him back to surrender my home and negotiate a peaceful transfer of my wealth. Henry marched back up the driveway with heavy, aggressive strides. Sophia followed closely behind him. Her face was twisted into a smug and victorious sneer. They climbed the brick steps and stepped back onto my front porch. They invaded my personal space once again. Henry stood mere inches from my chest, attempting to use his physical size to establish absolute dominance. He did not ask what I wanted. He simply held out his open palm and demanded that I hand over the house keys and the primary bank account passwords. I stood perfectly still and kept my hands resting calmly at my sides. I looked directly into his eyes and asked him what would happen if I refused to comply. I asked him to explain exactly what his next move would be. Henry laughed. It was a cold and hollow sound entirely devoid of any genuine amusement. He lowered his head and began to outline his conspiracy with terrifying absolute clarity. He told me that my little stunt with the bank freeze was nothing but a temporary inconvenience. He stated that he did not need the fake doctor who had just run away. He bragged that he knew half a dozen corrupt medical professionals who would gladly sign a formal declaration of mental incompetence for a small cut of the estate. He promised me he would have a judge declare me legally senile by the end of the month. Sophia stepped forward and added her own venom to the conversation. She told me I had brought this entire situation upon myself. She stated that I was a selfish and paranoid old man who was hoarding wealth that rightfully belonged to her. She looked me straight in the eyes and promised that they would sell this house the very second the guardianship papers were stamped. She told me they would lock me away in the cheapest state-run medical facility they could find. She swore I would spend the rest of my life rotting in a miserable room while they spent every single dollar Eleanor and I had saved over 4 decades. Henry nodded in agreement and crossed his arms over his chest. He explicitly declared that he was going to drain the equity from this property and liquidate my retirement portfolios to cover his debts. He boasted that he had already forged my signature on the initial banking documents and that he would gladly forge it 100 more times to get what he wanted. He admitted his crimes out loud on my front porch, completely blinded by his own arrogance. He firmly believed there were absolutely no witnesses to his confession. He believed he was completely untouchable. I listened to their venomous tirade in total silence. I absorbed every single word they spoke. I did not interrupt them. I did not offer any defense. I simply allowed them to dig their own graves with their own arrogant voices. I was a structural engineer, and I was watching a condemned building actively tear down its own load-bearing pillars. I waited until Henry had completely finished his threats. I waited until the quiet evening air settled around us once again. I asked Henry if that was his final and absolute plan. I asked him if he was entirely committed to stealing my assets and destroying my life. Henry smiled a cruel and predatory smile. He told me it was a guaranteed certainty. He demanded the keys one last time and ordered me to step aside. I did not step aside. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my cellular phone. I looked down at the dark screen and pressed a single tactile button on the side of the device. The sound of heavy wooden wheels rolling across metal tracks shattered the quiet tension. The massive solid oak pocket doors separating the entryway from the formal dining room slid rapidly open. The sudden noise caused Henry and Sophia to flinch and step backward toward the edge of the porch. The interior of the house was brightly illuminated. Arthur Camden stepped out of the dining room and walked into the grand foyer. My corporate attorney was wearing an immaculate dark suit and carried an aura of absolute unyielding authority. He did not look like a man coming to negotiate. He looked like an executioner arriving to fulfill a mandate. He stopped just inside the open front door and stared coldly at my son-in-law. Detective Miller and Detective Hayes stepped out of the shadow square directly behind Camden. They were both wearing their heavy tactical vests with their gold police shields prominently displayed on their chests. They walked past the attorney and stepped out onto the front porch. The physical manifestation of absolute justice had suddenly invaded the space. Henry froze. The smug, triumphant smile melted off his face and pulled on the brick steps. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. He stared at the police detectives in pure, unadulterated horror. He realized in a fraction of a second that he had just confessed to a massive federal conspiracy directly in front of 2 sworn law enforcement officers. Sophia let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She took another step backward and bumped into the wooden porch railing. She looked at Camden and then at the detectives. Her eyes darted wildly around the enclosed space as her brain tried to process the catastrophic reality of the situation. The invisible trap had finally sprung. The jaws of Eleanor's meticulously designed Faylafe had snapped entirely shut around their necks. Detective Miller raised his right hand. He was holding a thick stack of official legal documents. The papers were stamped with heavy red seals. He looked directly at Henry and announced that he was holding active felony arrest warrants. He stated the charges in a loud, booming voice that echoed across the neighborhood. He listed conspiracy to commit wire fraud, forgery of financial documents, and conspiracy to commit burglary. I turned my back on my daughter and her husband. I walked over to the console table in the hallway. I picked up Eleanor's heavy black leather ledger. I picked up the waterproof silicone bag containing the original forged equity line contracts. I picked up the carbon copy of the formal written confession Marks had signed just 3 nights ago. I gathered the entire physical manifestation of their destruction into my hands. I walked back out onto the porch and handed the heavy stack of evidence directly to Detective Hayes. I told the detective that this was the complete architectural blueprint of their crimes. I stated that my wife had spent her final dying months compiling the raw data and that I had secured the physical proof. I told the officers that the structural demolition was now entirely complete. Detective Miller stepped forward and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He grabbed Henry's arm and twisted it violently behind his back. The metal ratchets clicked loudly as the cuffs locked into place. Detective Hayes moved toward Sophia and ordered her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Sophia began to sob hysterically, screaming that she was my daughter and begging me to stop them. I stood on the threshold of my secure home and watched the detectives drag them down the driveway toward the waiting patrol cars. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any sorrow. I felt the deep, resonant peace of a man who had finally cut away the rot, threatening to destroy his foundation. I watched the flashing red and blue lights reflect against the dark trees. The silent reckoning had concluded. My home was finally safe. The heavy oak doors of the dining room had concealed the ultimate trap. Detective Miller maintained a rigid grip on Henry's arm. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked into place with a sharp metallic sound that echoed across the quiet suburban lawn. Henry was no longer a confident financial predator. He was a terrified criminal realizing the absolute finality of his situation. He began to beg the detectives for a chance to explain. He babbled uncontrollably. He claimed that the forged equity line was just a temporary loan. He swore he was going to repay the money. He insisted that the midnight burglary was a terrible misunderstanding and that his associate Marcus had acted on his own accord. Detective Hayes did not entertain the pathetic lies. The seasoned investigator simply read Henry his Miranda rights in a calm and practiced voice. Every word of the warning fell upon the front porch like a physical weight. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Henry turned his head and looked at Arthur Camden. He pleaded with the corporate attorney. He begged Camden to negotiate a settlement. He promised he would sign over the luxury cars and the designer jewelry if they would just take the handcuffs off. Arthur Camden adjusted his suit jacket and looked at my son-in-law with profound disgust. The attorney stated that he did not negotiate with felons. He informed Henry that the federal prosecutor already possessed the digital fraud packet and the signed confession from the burglar. Camden explained that the state would be pursuing maximum consecutive sentences for the forgery and the conspiracy charges. He advised Henry that his only remaining legal strategy was to remain completely silent and pray for a very lenient judge. Detective Miller pushed Henry forward. They walked him down the brick steps and led him down the long paved driveway. Henry dragged his feet. He looked back over his shoulder, hoping for a last-minute reprieve that was never going to come. He was shoved unceremoniously into the back of the waiting patrol car. The heavy door slammed shut. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his pale and terrified face through the reinforced glass window. Sophia had completely frozen against the wooden porch railing. Detective Hayes turned to my daughter and informed her that she was not being detained tonight. He explained that the burglary confession specifically implicated her husband. However, he made it explicitly clear that her involvement in the federal wire fraud operation was actively under investigation. He told her not to leave the city and warned her that federal agents would be contacting her very soon. The patrol car engine roared to life. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and drove off into the darkness, taking my son-in-law away to a maximum security holding cell. Arthur Camden nodded to me once. He stated he would begin preparing the final asset protection protocols in the morning. He turned and walked to his own vehicle, leaving me alone with my daughter on the front porch. The flashing lights disappeared around the corner. The quiet peace of the neighborhood slowly returned. Sophia stood on the driveway, completely isolated. The arrogant sneer she had worn just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. The reality of her absolute poverty finally crushed her. The bank accounts were frozen. Her credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. Her husband was on his way to federal prison. Her fake medical evaluator had abandoned her. She was stranded in the dark without a single dollar to her name. She slowly turned around and looked at me. I stood on the threshold of my secure home. I did not move a single muscle. I watched the mechanical gears turning in her mind. I saw her realize that her aggressive intimidation tactics had catastrophically failed. She needed a new strategy. She needed a new angle of manipulation. Sophia took a hesitant step toward the porch. Her lower lip began to tremble. She forced tears into her eyes. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times before. She collapsed onto her knees on the hard concrete driveway. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob loudly. The sound was pathetic and hollow. "Dad, please," she cried out. Her voice was thick with fake desperation. "You have to help me. I had no idea Henry was doing all of those terrible things, I swear to you. I did not know about the forged loan. He controlled all the finances. He lied to me just like he lied to you. You have to believe me, Dad. I am your daughter. You cannot leave me out here." I listened to her desperate monologue in total silence. I analyzed her words with the cold detachment of a forensic auditor. She was attempting to rewrite history on the spot. She was trying to shift the entire burden of guilt onto her husband to save herself. But I had read Eleanor's ledger. I knew Sophia had personally orchestrated the theft of her mother's necklace. I knew she had spent the stolen equity money on designer clothes and luxury resort vacations. Her ignorance was a convenient and desperate lie. She crawled forward on her knees until she reached the bottom step of the porch. She looked up at me with mascara running down her cheeks. "Dad, please let me come inside," she begged. "I have nowhere else to go. The hotel in Mexico took everything we had. The landlord evicted us from our apartment because Henry stopped paying the rent. I do not have a car. I do not have a phone. Please just let me sleep in my old bedroom. We can fix this in the morning. You can call Arthur Camden and post bail for Henry. We can work this out as a family. I promise I will do whatever you want. I will be a better daughter. Just please do not lock me out." I looked down at this woman kneeling on the concrete. I did not feel a single ounce of paternal affection. I did not feel anger or sorrow or pity. I only felt a deep, resonant emptiness. The daughter I had raised had vanished decades ago. The person begging on my driveway was simply a parasite searching for a new host. She believed that my love was an infinite resource she could exploit forever. She believed that a few fake tears would erase the massive structural damage she had intentionally inflicted upon our family. I reached up and touched my chest. My fingers found the heavy silver chain resting against my shirt. I closed my hand around the silver medallion that hung from the links. It was the same medallion Sophia had paid a stranger to steal and incinerate. It was the gateway to the vault containing the ultimate truth. The cool metal grounded me. It reminded me of Eleanor. It reminded me of the agonizing pain my wife had endured to map out this exact conspiracy. Eleanor had used her final breaths to build a defensive fortress around me. I was not going to let the enemy back inside the gates. Sophia saw me touch the necklace. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. The fake tears completely stopped. The realization washed over her. She knew instantly that I possessed the one piece of evidence she thought was destroyed forever. She knew I understood the absolute depths of her betrayal. "You sold your mother's legacy for a luxury vacation," I stated. My voice was a complete void of emotion. It was the flat, steady tone of an engineer finalizing a demolition report. "You sold the last piece of her memory just to cover your tracks. You stood in this house and smiled at me while you drained my life savings. You tried to declare me legally insane so you could steal my freedom." "Dad, I am sorry," she whispered. Her voice was genuine now, stripped of all manipulation. The pure terror of her isolation finally broke through her facade. I let go of the silver medallion. I looked at her with absolute finality. "You sold my wife," I said. The words echoed in the quiet night air, carrying the heavy weight of absolute judgment. "You have nothing left to sell." I did not wait for her response. I did not want to hear another lie or another pathetic excuse. I turned my back on her and stepped inside the grand foyer. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door and pulled it shut. The thick oak panel blocked out the sight of her kneeling on the driveway. I turned the new reinforced steel deadbolt. The lock engaged with a loud and satisfying mechanical thud. The physical barrier was now completely impenetrable. I stood in the quiet hallway of my home and listened. For a few minutes, I could hear Sophia sobbing and pounding her fists against the solid wood. She screamed my name, demanding that I open the door. She hurled insults and curses into the night air, but the heavy insulation of the house absorbed the noise, reducing her rage to a pathetic, muffled buzzing. Eventually, the pounding stopped. The yelling faded away. I walked into the living room and looked out the front window, through a narrow gap in the heavy curtains. I watched my daughter slowly stand up from the concrete driveway. She looked around the empty suburban street, realizing that no one was coming to rescue her. She turned and began to walk away. She walked down the long road, disappearing into the dark shadows cast by the tall oak trees. I closed the curtains and walked back into the kitchen. I turned off the overhead lights. The house settled into a deep and profound silence. The air felt clean and breathable. The massive pressure that had threatened to collapse my life was entirely gone. Eleanor's magnificent trap had perfectly executed its design. The infection had been permanently excised from my world. I walked toward the stairs, feeling the quiet strength of a structure that had survived the storm. The foundation was sound. The quiet reckoning was over. Equilibrium was finally restored. True family is built on mutual respect and unbreakable trust, not just the sharing of a bloodline. When greed and entitlement replace basic human decency, the foundation of love inevitably crumbles. William's journey teaches us that setting absolute boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary measure of survival. It takes immense strength to recognize when a toxic relationship cannot be salvaged, and even greater courage to walk away. Realizing your own worth allows you to rebuild your life on solid ground, free from the manipulation of those who view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more tales of standing strong against betrayal, please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to our channel.